The server room hummed at a frequency Daniel Mercer had long stopped hearing. It was the kind of sound that burrowed into the skull after enough nights, not noise anymore, just presence, like a second heartbeat. 3-Gomes, RX, MM. The terminal glow on his face was the only light worth mentioning in Bay 4. Everything else had gone dim 2 hours ago when the third shift janitor cut through on his way out, hit the overhead toggle by mistake, and never came back to fix it. Daniel hadn't moved to fix it either. He'd been watching a pattern in the access logs that made the overhead lights feel beside the point. He had been awake for 19 hours, not because anyone asked him to be. He was scheduled for 8. He'd clocked in at 7:30, flagged an anomaly in the sync protocol at 9:15, filed an internal incident report at 9:40, received an automated acknowledgement at 9:41, and then nothing. By midnight, the anomaly had metastasized into something he didn't have a word for yet. Not breach, not failure. Something more deliberate than either. He made coffee from the machine in the break room at 12:30. Bad coffee. He drank it standing up, already moving back toward his station. By 2 a.m., he had sent a second report, more detailed. He had attached log excerpts, annotated the timestamps in red, written a plain language summary in the subject line that read, "Urgent, active data exfiltration suspected. Recommend immediate security review." He had CC'd the CTO's office. He had CC'd the internal security inbox. He had included a direct cell number at the bottom, which was against protocol, but felt necessary. He was composing a third message, shorter and blunter, when his head went down. He didn't decide to sleep. There was no decision. One moment the cursor was blinking. The next, it still was, but 11 minutes had passed. He didn't hear the elevator. He didn't hear the footsteps' heels on polished concrete, deliberate. He heard the voice, "Mr. Mercer." It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Catherine Voss had a way of delivering a name that made the room smaller. She was the chief operating officer of Nexogen Data Systems, 41 years old, and she had an opinion about everything she observed, formed rapidly and rarely revised. Beside her stood Gregory Holt, the CFO, who had followed her in from whatever late-night dinner he'd been attending. His jacket was still on. He smelled faintly of wine. Daniel's head came up. He registered Catherine first, then Gregory. Then the expression on Gregory's face, something that was trying to look concerned but had landed closer to satisfied. "I can't explain. You were asleep." Catherine's voice was even, factual. "I was awake," for he stopped, restarted. "There's something happening in the system. Tonight. I've been documenting it since 9 o'clock. I sent 2 incident reports. I can pull them up right now. At 3 a.m., in a critical infrastructure bay." Gregory said, "You were asleep at your workstation. I wasn't. I had been awake for 19 hours tracking an active, this is a termination conversation." Catherine said. Not unkindly. Just closed. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. The terminal behind him continued its quiet work. The fans spun. The pattern in the logs that had kept him awake for 11 hours was still there, still moving, still doing whatever it was doing to the company's data architecture. He said, "The Q data is being siphoned. Incrementally. Whoever's doing it knows the ingestion schedule. They're pulling during the sync windows so it reads as routine traffic. I documented everything. It's in the reports." Catherine looked at him without expression. "I'll need your badge and your access credentials by morning," she said. Daniel nodded slowly. He reached into his desk drawer. He took out a photograph Lily at the beach, 7 years old, squinting against the light, holding a sand dollar with both hands, like it was made of something rare. He put it in his jacket pocket. He walked to the elevator without another word. Behind him, the screen still glowed. 312 RM. The third incident report he'd been composing was still open in the draft folder, unsent. The cursor blinked once, twice, 3 times. No one closed the window. The email existed. That was the thing about it. It wasn't hypothetical. Wasn't rumored. Wasn't a matter of interpretation. It was a 1.4 kilobyte text file, sitting in 6 inboxes simultaneously, with a read receipt request attached to each one, all of which went unanswered. Sent, 9:42 p.m. Subject: Urgent active data exfiltration suspected, recommend immediate security review. Catherine Voss had not seen it because she'd been in an investor call from 8 to 11, and her assistant filtered her inbox with aggressive judgment about what constituted an emergency from a systems engineer on night shift. The CTO's office had a shared inbox managed by a rotating coordinator, and the coordinator for that week was 3 days into a stomach flu and operating at reduced capacity. The internal security inbox was real. It was also monitored by one person, Dennis, who worked a 9 to 5 and had left the office at 5:01. Gregory Holt had received it directly. His read receipt showed the email had been opened at 10:07 p.m. He had not replied. He had not forwarded it. He had not flagged it. What he had done, at 10:09 p.m., was send a text message to a number not in the Nexigen directory that read, he noticed. How far along are you? The reply came at 10:11. 40%. Needs 6 more hours. Gregory had put his phone face down on his dinner table, picked up his fork, and finished his meal. This was the shape of things when Daniel Mercer walked out of the building at 3:18 a.m. By 4 a.m., the automated monitoring system, the one Daniel had spent 8 months helping to configure, began generating alerts. They were low-priority flags. Because someone had adjusted the sensitivity threshold on the exfiltration detector 2 weeks earlier, reclassifying a certain class of irregular sync behavior as routine. The adjustment had been submitted through a legitimate admin portal with a valid credential at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. Daniel had not been working the Tuesday shift. The alerts at 4 a.m. said, minor traffic irregularity detected. Monitoring. By 6:30 a.m., when the first shift team began arriving, 22% of the client dataset repository was inaccessible. The alerts now said, file access error. Please contact system administrator. There was no system administrator on site. The system administrator had been walked out at 3:18 a.m. By 7:45, it was 31%. Daniel Mercer lived in a 2-bedroom apartment on the 4th floor of a building that had been built with ambition and maintained with resignation. The carpet in the hallway was a particular shade of gray that no one had chosen. It had simply arrived, through enough foot traffic and enough time. His apartment was different. Not expensive, not decorated in any way that would appear in a magazine, but considered the kind of space that someone had thought about with limited resources and genuine care. A bookshelf along the east wall, organized not alphabetically but by size and then color, which was either eccentric or practical depending on your perspective. A kitchen table with 4 chairs, only 2 of which were used. A child's drawings pinned above the radiator. A running series spanning 2 years, charting Lily's evolving opinions about horses, weather, and a recurring character she called Captain Blue, whose nature remained unclear. He came through the door at 3:51 a.m. The apartment was quiet in the specific way. Apartments are quiet when a child is sleeping in them, a quality of quiet that's different from empty quiet, weighted, inhabited. He set his bag down. He hung up his jacket. He stood in the kitchen for a moment with the light off, then opened the refrigerator, not because he was hungry, but because the light was familiar. He closed it without taking anything. He walked to Lily's room. She was 8 years old and slept with remarkable commitment. Arms flung wide, one knee bent, as though she'd been interrupted mid-cartwheel. Her nightlight projected slow-moving stars across the ceiling. He stood in the doorway and watched the stars move. Then he pulled her blanket up an inch. It was already covering her. He pulled it up anyway. In his own room, he sat at the narrow desk by the window, the desk that served as his home office, filing system, and occasional breakfast table. His laptop was old enough to have a fan that labored on startup. He opened it. He did not go to the Nexigen employee portal. He had no access to it. His credentials had been deactivated at 3:20 a.m., confirmed by the brief, unsuccessful login attempt he'd made from the parking lot. Not out of defiance, but out of verification. He opened instead a separate terminal window. A personal one. He navigated through a folder structure that existed nowhere on Nexagen's servers. It was on a private cloud instance he maintained personally, paying for it out of pocket at $11 a month. 8 months ago, during the initial build of Nexagen's recovery architecture, Daniel had done something that was not technically against policy, but that had never been formally approved. He had built a failsafe, not a backdoor. That word implied deception, hidden entry, malicious geometry. This was something else. It was an autonomous recovery system, a set of cascading restoration protocols that could be triggered from an external authenticated endpoint if the internal monitoring infrastructure failed to act within a defined window. He'd written it because the internal system had a gap, a 40-minute blind spot during certain sync operations, and he'd gotten tired of worrying about what would happen if something went wrong in that window, and no one was watching. He had documented it. He had included the documentation in a technical annex submitted to the CTO's office 7 months ago. The annex was 6 pages long. It had received an automated acknowledgement. He had built the system because he thought it was the right thing to do. He opened the monitoring dashboard now. The data was coming in from Nexagen's public-facing infrastructure latency metrics, error rates, the kind of thing any external researcher could observe without credentials. What he saw made him straighten in his chair. He heard a sound from the hallway. Lily stood in the doorway in pajamas printed with small yellow moons, hair disordered, blinking at the lamp on his desk. "Ba?" She still used the word sometimes. A holdover from the 18 months they'd spent in a bilingual daycare program she'd loved. "Are you back already?" "I came home early," he said. She padded over and leaned against his arm, looking at the screen without comprehension, but without concern either. Screens were screens. Ba was at a screen. This was normal. "Are you working?" "I'm just checking something." She considered this. "Is it broken?" He looked at the error cascade spreading across the dashboard. 34% and climbing. "A little bit," he said. She nodded seriously. "You'll fix it." She said it without drama, without performance. Just a fact. The way you might say it'll stop raining eventually, or the sun comes up in the east. She shuffled back to her room. He listened to her settle. Then he began to work. Catherine Voss arrived at the Nexagen offices at 7:55 a.m., which was earlier than usual. She'd received 3 messages on the drive, in 2 from the IT floor lead and 1 from her assistant, all variants of the same theme. She walked into a room that had the specific energy of professionals trying very hard not to look panicked. The IT team had gathered around a cluster of workstations in the center of the open floor. There were 6 of them. They were talking in low voices that didn't quite achieve calm. On the main display wall, a series of status dashboards showed a landscape of red and yellow indicators that had been green when everyone went home the previous evening. "How bad?" Catherine said, to no one in particular and everyone at once. Marcus Webb, the IT floor lead 29, capable. Currently the color of uncooked dough, turned from his station. "We're at 38% unavailability on the primary client repository," he said. "The sync logs show a series of overlapping read operations starting around midnight that we don't have a clean explanation for yet. The data isn't deleted, we can see that much. But we can't access it through normal pathways." "Is this an attack?" Marcus hesitated. "It's consistent with an exfiltration pattern. But the traffic signatures don't match anything we have profiles for." "Is it ransomware?" "No encryption indicators." Catherine absorbed this. "Where's Gregory?" Nobody answered immediately. Then someone said, "He called in. Said he'd be here by 9. "And security?" "Who's heading security response?" Another pause. Longer. Daniel Marcus started, then stopped. "Daniel Mercer was terminated last night," Catherine said. "Right." Marcus looked at his hands. "He was the one who built most of the..." "Yeah. What exactly did he build? That we can't operate without him." The silence that followed was not comfortable. A junior engineer named Priya Chandler, 24 years old, had been with Nexagen for 7 months. She sat at the edge of the group, quieter than the rest, and she said carefully, "He built the recovery architecture, the whole thing. He also wrote the documentation. But the documentation is stored it's in the internal wiki. But the wiki is one of the systems currently unavailable, Marcus finished. Catherine looked at the red wall of status indicators. 40%, someone said quietly, watching a counter tick. From across the room, a phone began to ring. It was the main client relations line. Then another one. Then a third. Catherine turned and walked to her office. She closed the door. She stood at her window, looking at the city below, which was doing what cities do in the morning, moving, ordinary, indifferent. She thought about the man she had terminated at 3:18 a.m. She thought about the sentence he had said before she cut him off. The Q data is being siphoned. Incrementally. She had not asked him to elaborate. She walked back to her desk and pulled up her email. She found the incident reports. She read them in full, for the first time, at 8:42 a.m. The first file came back at 9:11 a.m. Marcus Webb was the one who noticed. He was running a manual inventory check, cataloging what was missing versus what was recoverable, when a folder that had been inaccessible since before sunrise simply appeared. Not gradually, not with any error message or confirmation dialogue. It was gone, and then it was there. The way a word comes back to you after you've stopped trying to remember it. He stared at it for a moment. He opened it. The contents were intact. "Hey," he said. To nobody. To the room. Priya looked up. "This folder was down," Marcus said. "Which one?" "Client Archive, Partition 3, the Henderson Group files." It was red all morning. They both looked at the folder. "Did you do something?" Priya said. "I didn't touch it." They watched the status dashboard. One indicator had gone from red to green. Then, at 9:17, a second one. At 9:24, 3 more. Marcus pulled up the access logs. He checked them twice, then a third time. He compared them against the authentication records for every active credential in the system. He cross-referenced with the VPN connection log. He checked the remote desktop registry. Nothing. No internal login had initiated any recovery action. No external connection through official channels had occurred. "Someone is fixing this," he said. "Who?" Priya said. He looked at the access log. It showed no author. It showed no user. It showed, in the field where an authenticated account name should have been, a process identifier he didn't recognize, a 16-character string that matched no user account in their directory. "I don't know," he said. "But they know what they're doing." He picked up his desk phone and called Catherine Voss's extension. She answered on the first ring. "Something is recovering the data," he said. "I don't know how. There's no active internal session I can trace it to. But files are coming back online. Someone is working in the system right now, and they're not coming through any door I can see." There was a long pause. "Marcus," Catherine said slowly, "what do you know about the fail-safe architecture?" "The recovery system? Which you mean the annex? The CTO's office annex? Is there documentation on an external recovery endpoint? Something Daniel Mercer built?" Another pause. Shorter. "I never read the annex," Marcus said. "I didn't know it existed." He made Lily breakfast at 7:30, scrambled eggs and toast. The toast slightly too dark because he was watching the terminal and not the toaster. She didn't complain. She ate without ceremony, reading a book about deep-sea creatures propped against the orange juice carton. By 8, she was at school. He'd walked her 4 blocks through morning air that smelled like cut grass and diesel, and called out a goodbye at the school gate that she acknowledged with a wave that was technically in his direction. He came back to the apartment. He made coffee that was better than the break room version because he'd had a French press for 3 years and had learned how to use it. He sat at his desk. The fail-safe system he'd built was not elegant, in the way that genuinely useful things rarely are. It was methodical. It was careful. It had been written over 6 months of night shifts, a few hundred lines at a time, tested against failure scenarios he'd invented, and then worked systematically to defeat. It was, in the most precise sense of the word, thorough. What it did, at its core, was this. It monitored Nexagon's publicly observable infrastructure. When it detected failure signatures that matched a defined threshold data unavailability above a certain percentage, combined with access pattern anomalies consistent with exfiltration, It initiated a restoration sequence using a recovery archive that Daniel had maintained on a separate, air-gapped adjacent system. The recovery archive was populated automatically during each sync cycle, creating a rolling 48-hour shadow of the primary data, stored off-site but mappable back to the primary system's architecture. The trigger had activated at 4:17 a.m. Daniel had not triggered it. The system had triggered itself, exactly as designed. What Daniel was doing now was monitoring, watching the restoration proceed, intervening manually when a file conflict arose that the automated system couldn't resolve without human judgment. There were 12 such conflicts in the first 2 hours. He resolved each one, working in focused silence, making decisions that required knowing the data structure at a level of intimacy that took 8 months to develop. He was not logged into Nexagen's systems. He was communicating with them through the authenticated external endpoint, the one he'd documented in the annex, the one with its own credential set that existed in the recovery architecture's authentication layer, not the main directory. His process identifier was Nexagen, FSYS, Recovery, V2, 1Xt. He had never given it a better name. He'd meant to. He worked without music. The apartment was quiet. Lily's drawing of Captain Blue, a blue figure of ambiguous species, standing on what appeared to be a cloud, or possibly a hill, or possibly a very large sandwich, looked down from above the radiator with the equanimity of the deeply confident. At 9:11, the first folder came back online. He watched the confirmation. He moved to the next conflict item on the queue. He worked the way he always worked, without announcement, without audience, attending to the thing that needed attending. The board of directors convened an emergency session at 11 a.m. By that time, data recovery was at 63%. The pace of restoration was accelerating, and Gregory Holt had arrived at the office at 9:40, looking composed in a way that, in retrospect, would seem like a mistake. He had walked into the situation with the practiced ease of someone who expected to control it. He had offered opinions about the failure. He had suggested engaging an external cybersecurity firm. He had, at one point, said the words, "This is precisely why we need redundant oversight protocols," which was an observation so perfectly timed that Priya Chandler, who had said almost nothing all morning, looked at him with an expression she quickly reassembled into neutrality. The board session lasted 4 hours. Catherine had spent the intervening time doing two things simultaneously: managing the client communications crisis and reading everything she could find about the recovery system that was quietly restoring the company's data architecture without any of them touching it. She found the annex, the physical copy, printed and filed in the CTO's document archive, which she pulled herself because the digital version was in the wiki, which had come back online at 10:52 but was still slow. She read it cover to cover. She read it a second time. Then she handed it to the company's head of legal, a methodical woman named Ruth Stanhope, and said, "I need you to look at this, and I need someone to pull Gregory Holt's email archive from the last 3 months." Ruth looked at the annex. She looked at Catherine. "I need a warrant for that," Ruth said. "You need a cause," Catherine said. "I'm giving you cause." The email archive pull was initiated at 10:23. By 11:15, Forensic Accounting had a preliminary review. By noon, the FBI's cyber division had been contacted. Gregory Holt's texts, which had been backed up to a corporate device registered under a subsidiary expense account, documented a months-long arrangement. A competing data analytics firm, a contact inside that firm, 43% of Nexagen's client dataset had been contracted for transfer. The operation had been designed to look like a systems failure, a confused, cascading technical crisis that would eliminate the evidence in the noise of the catastrophe. It had worked, almost. Daniel Mercer's recovery system had started working at 4:17 a.m. It had, in the process, preserved the exfiltration logs intact, the same logs that showed exactly what had been taken, when, and by whose authentication credentials. Gregory Holt was escorted from the building at 2:14 p.m. by 2 federal agents who had been briefed in the elevator on the way up. He passed Marcus Webb's workstation. He passed Priya Chandler's desk. He passed the break room where the bad coffee machine stood without ceremony. No one said anything. The data recovery indicator, visible on the main floor display, read 89%. Restoration in progress. She found the address through HR. She could have sent a message, had drafted one, deleted it, drafted another, but a message felt like the wrong shape for this particular apology. Messages could be ignored or read once and filed. They had a flatness that she didn't think she'd earned. She took a car, not a company car, her own. The building was ordinary. She'd grown up in buildings like this, actually. Before the career had accelerated things, the hallway carpet was the particular institutional gray of places that were maintained without being attended to. She knocked on 4D at 5:30 p.m. There was a brief silence. Then footsteps. Light ones. Then a pause. She could feel the small judgment happening on the other side of the door. The child assessment of, do I know this person? The door opened 4 inches, still on the chain. One brown eye. Approximately 8 years old. Studying her with the frank evaluation of someone who had not yet learned to pretend they weren't looking. Hi, Catherine said. Hi, said the eye. Is your dad home? The eye considered this. Who are you? I work with him. Worked with him. She stopped. My name is Catherine. I just need to talk to him for a few minutes, if that's okay. The eye withdrew. There was a conversation in the interior of the apartment, too quiet to hear. Then Daniel's voice, saying something brief. Then, footsteps returning. The chain came off. The door opened fully. The girl had retreated to the kitchen table, where she was doing homework with the focused disregard of a child who had decided this was not her business. Daniel stood in the doorway between the entrance hall and the living area. He was in a gray sweatshirt and jeans. He looked, she thought, less tired than she'd expected. Not rested but calm in a way that seemed structural rather than situational. She looked past him at the apartment. The bookshelf. The drawings above the radiator. The laptop on the desk, screen still open, a terminal window visible. She had prepared something to say. A few sentences, careful ones, that acknowledged what had happened without leaning too hard on the company's legal exposure, which Ruth had flagged as a concern. Balanced sentences, appropriate sentences. She said instead, I didn't read your emails. Daniel looked at her. The first one. The second one. I didn't read them until she stopped. I'm sorry. He was quiet for a moment. Not uncomfortable quiet. Thinking quiet. The second one had a plain language subject line. He said. It wasn't an accusation. It was just a fact. Offered, without inflection. I know. I wrote it that way because I thought someone would see it. I know. He nodded once. Not forgiveness. Not its absence. An acknowledgement. Gregory Holt is in federal custody, she said. I heard. He'd seen it in the news alert that had come across his phone at 3:40. He'd looked at it for a moment and then put his phone face down. The system you built recovered 91% before it required any manual intervention, Catherine said. I read the annex. I read it twice. The annex was submitted 7 months ago. She took that without deflection. Yes. From the kitchen, the sound of homework pages turning, a pencil being set down and picked back up. Catherine said, I'd like to offer you your position back, with a substantial adjustment to the terms, and an equity stake in the infrastructure division, which we're restructuring under new leadership. She paused. Gregory's position will need to be filled by someone who... I'm not interested in Gregory's position, Daniel said. Not unkindly. She waited. I'll consider a consulting arrangement, he said. Remote. I have a specific schedule I need to keep. She glanced involuntarily toward the kitchen. He didn't follow her gaze. He didn't need to. I can accommodate that, she said. He nodded. We'll talk through the specifics, he said. Send me the terms and I'll review them. She turned to leave, then stopped. The recovery system, she said. The fail-safe. How long did it take you to build it? He thought about it. 6 months, give or take. Did you know you might need it? I hoped I wouldn't. She looked at him for a moment. Thank you, she said. And meant it in the simple, clean way that was the only version of thank you that costs anything. He nodded once. She left. He closed the door. He stood in the entrance hall for a moment. listening to the sound of the building other apartments. Muffled TVs, a door closing 3 floors up. "Was that your boss?" Lily called from the kitchen. "Used to be," he said. "Is she nice?" He considered this with genuine fairness. "She's learning," he said. It came at 11:47 p.m., when most of the city had gone quiet. He was asleep. Actually asleep. The first time in what felt like a geologic era, when his monitoring system sent an alert to his phone. Not an emergency alert. A watchdog ping. The kind his system sent when it detected something worth looking at, not something worth waking up in a cold sweat for. He looked at it. Then he sat up. The recovery process was 94% complete, but the remaining 6%, a specific partition of the client dataset, the most sensitive segment, containing financial modeling data for 11 of Nexigen's largest accounts, had hit a conflict cluster. 17 overlapping file locks, the kind that automated restoration protocols couldn't navigate without human judgment about which version was canonical. He could let it wait until morning. It would wait. The data wasn't going anywhere. It was stable in the recovery archive, just not yet restored to the live system. In 6 hours, when the IT team arrived, someone could open a ticket, escalate it, potentially get it resolved by end of day, possibly by end of week, depending on who was assigned. Or, he got up. He made coffee. He sat at his desk. Lily was asleep in the next room. The nightlight was on. He could see the soft edge of its glow from under her door. He opened the terminal. He worked for 2 hours and 40 minutes. The conflict cluster was not a single problem, but 17 separate ones, each requiring its own resolution, and 3 of those required him to trace the file lineage back through 4 months of version history to determine which copy represented the correct canonical state. He resolved all 17. At 2:31 a.m., the recovery indicator ticked to 100%. He sat for a moment and looked at it. Then he closed the terminal. He washed his coffee cup. He went back to bed. He did not send a notification. He did not leave a note. He did not request acknowledgement. In the morning, Marcus Webb would arrive at his workstation, open his dashboard, and see a status board that was entirely green for the first time in 36 hours. He would stare at it for a long time. He would eventually check the logs and find the resolution records. Time-stamped between 12:03 and 2:31 a.m. Attributed to Nexigen, FSYS, Recovery, V2, 1XT. He would not know what to do with that, exactly. He would tell Priya. Priya would be quiet for a moment. He stayed up until 2:30 in Nokonsta morning, she would say, to fix it. After they fired him, Marcus would not have a response to this that felt adequate to the fact. 3 weeks later, a Saturday morning, sunlight coming in at the low angle of late spring, hitting the bookshelf and laying a line of light across the spines. Lily at the kitchen table with a bowl of cereal and a library book about oceanography she'd selected herself, which was currently open to a section on bioluminescent organisms that she found, as she had explained to Daniel twice. Deeply incredible. Daniel was making pancakes. Not from a box. He had a recipe he'd been using for 4 years, handwritten on a note card tucked into the cabinet door. A recipe given to him by his aunt when he moved into his first apartment, on the occasion of Lily being born, because she'd said, "Learn to make something good for breakfast. Children, remember breakfast." He'd been making them ever since. The consulting arrangement had been finalized 11 days earlier. 3 days a week, remote. At a rate that had made him read the email twice to confirm he hadn't misread the number. The schedule was his. He chose the hours. He had flagged 7:30 to 8:30 a.m. on weekdays as unavailable, which was the window in which he walked Lily to school. Nobody had argued. Catherine Voss had sent him, separately, a copy of a new internal policy document, Incident Report Review Protocol Mandatory Response SLA. All flagged security incidents, regardless of the hour they were reported, to receive human review within 2 hours. Direct escalation chain, named accountability at each tier. He had read it. He hadn't responded to the email. He thought it was a reasonable policy. The board had issued a public statement acknowledging the events without naming names, which was standard. The FBI's case against Gregory Holt was proceeding. These were external facts, existing outside the apartment, moving at their own pace. The pancakes were ready. "Ready," he said. Lily looked up from bioluminescence and closed the book with the gentle precision of someone who intended to return to it imminently. She climbed onto her chair. He set the plate in front of her. She assessed the pancakes. She was serious about pancakes, and then reached for the syrup. "Bah," she said. "Mim. In the ocean there are fish that make their own light." She poured syrup with the focused attention of someone who had opinions about quantities, like they just decide to be bright. From inside, he sat down across from her. He poured his coffee. "That's what they do," she said. "Even when it's completely dark." She picked up her fork. She was looking at her plate, not at him, so she didn't see the small pause before he answered. "Yeah," he said. "That's what they do. They ate breakfast." Outside, the city moved through an ordinary Saturday traffic. Birds. Someone on the street below talking on a phone. The laptop on his desk was closed. The apartment held the particular warmth of morning in late spring. The kind that makes everything feel briefly suspended. Briefly sufficient. The system, somewhere in its distributed, humming life, ran at full capacity. Everything was in its right place.